Preface. I've come to recognize a sad but true reality of the world we live in. We live in a society that does not value mentorship. This book is my answer to that dilemma.
In this world of continual growth and change, the need for mentorship has never been more clear.
I've written this book for both current mentors and for those who do not yet value mentorship. We each have the opportunity to be a mentor to someone else, so let me show you how. And if you can't wrap your mind around mentorship, what it means, and why it matters, take a few glances through the pages that lie ahead and take in the stories on how mentorship impacted my life. As you will see, there were many times that I would not have succeeded, learned, or grown had it not been for the path of mentorship in my life. But I stand here today, after many years in business and living a life filled with different lessons and outcomes, to say that mentorship matters. Proverbs 27:17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another." The very premise of this book lies in these words. Mentorship is frequently thought of as a one-way road. It is always beneficial for the mentee, but does the mentor get anything out of it? The mentor does not hold the key to all wisdom. The mentor is a means to gain wisdom. But who's to say that the mentee cannot make an impact on the mentor's life? Just as iron collides to sharpen the other, a mentorship relationship binds people together to provide wisdom and understanding to one another. You may have had a preconceived notion that mentorship falls solely on the mentor, but I'm here to change that stigma and help you realize what the effect is when iron sharpens iron. If you approach this book without ever having thought twice about mentorship or what it means, I hope this book will act as a guide and expound on its importance. Most of all, I hope that you will in some way incorporate mentorship into your life, whether it be at work as a leader or in your personal life and the trials you face. We are relational beings, and we do need one another to help push us along. For the seasoned mentors, I hope this book acts as a solid guide as you sharpen others. And for the newbies, I pray mentorship touches your life as it has mine. Chapter 1. Treat people as if they were what they ought to be, and you help them too. Become what they are capable of being. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, a German writer from the 18th century and the author of Faust, wrote this quote in a book he published on the topic of apprenticeship, or what we would now define as mentorship today. In this book, I will give you insight into all I know about mentoring, the mentoring I have received, the mentoring I have given, and the study I have done. The quote is foundational to all of my experience and encapsulates my beliefs about mentoring, why it should happen, and how to do it. If you want to take mentoring seriously and to be effective at it, then that quote should become as familiar to you as it is to me. Make no mistake about it. Mentoring is work and will require something of you. It will require your commitment, your humility, your faith, and your trust. You cannot give away these attributes unless your heart and your attitude are in the right place. Only then will you be able to talk about encouragement, generosity, prayer, and forgiveness. My goal here is to not only walk you through the how-to steps of mentoring, but also impress on you the importance of heart and attitude. Mentoring is, and you'll hear me say this more than once, a relationship, not a task or a program. The subtitle of this book is something I take very seriously, that iron sharpens iron. As a mentor, you will come out of a relationship with a mentee as a different person than you were at the start. That word relationship should also alert you that mentoring is not expressly instructing someone on a task, nor is it considered the same as training. I want to be clear, I am a Christian, and this book will approach mentoring from a Christian perspective. This means that I cannot see and relate to a mentee only as a worker, but as an individual. And this might surprise you, but most people don't have a very high opinion of themselves. There's a voice in their head saying, "I'm not sure I can do that." One of your jobs as a mentor is the same job you have as a business leader to help them understand, yes, you can do this. Let me help. In the Bible, the verse James 3:13 says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom." I'd say this speaks into the life of a mentor pretty clearly. We are the ones who pass on wisdom. We do it with the utmost care possible so that our mentees too can bear this wisdom and knowledge. My mentorship begins. My appreciation for mentoring began with a stack of envelopes. After I graduated from Berkeley University in 1962, I drove a Coca-Cola route for my father, who was my most influential mentor. One of the stops on my route was the Selective Service Board, where I delivered 6 1-2-ounce Coke bottles. They appreciated my weekly services, and because of that, I was there often. I was doing my usual delivery one day and noticed a stack of envelopes on the counter. I looked at the woman sitting there behind the counter and asked her what they were. She looked me straight in the eyes and told me that they were draft notices. I'd spoken to her often during my deliveries, but this time was different. Maybe it was the tone of her voice or the way she looked at those envelopes. Something felt off. She told me that the envelopes were waiting to be mailed out, and then it hit me. I hadn't thought twice about the draft before then because I was not eligible to be drafted during my time in college. But right then and there, I realized that now that I had graduated, anything was possible. I stared at the stack of envelopes and felt the color leave my face. My name could have been in one of those envelopes that day, or maybe in the stack the next day, or the day after that. She must have seen my colorless face and knew what I was thinking. I didn't know what to do. In desperation, I asked her what I should do, and she advised me to get into a reserve unit. She told me to go to the Navy Reserve right there and then and sign my name, so I did just that. That woman must have really appreciated those 6 1-2-ounce Cokes. Of course, she'd need someone else to deliver them after that day. After signing, I asked myself what in the world I had just done. Was I really going to spend 4 years in the Navy? It didn't take long for a commander to call me and say that with my education, I needed to be a naval officer. After considerable thought, I decided to go to Officer Candidate School. They sent me to Newport, Rhode Island for 18 weeks of officer training. My now wife Judy and I were dating then, and there was no way I would leave her behind as a single woman. I proposed to her 2 weeks before I left. I assumed my business career was on a 4-year hold, but it turned out that it wasn't. I was assigned the duty of supply officer, which I had wanted, and away I went. After commissioning, I returned home, married Judy, and reported to the Naval Supply School in Athens, Georgia. After I graduated, the Navy assigned me to a vessel that was already in service and in constant movement. I finally caught up to the ship and boarded in Taiwan. After 2 or 3 days on board, an orderly knocked on my door and told me that the admiral wanted to have lunch with me the next day. I was in shock. Holy cow, I thought. Ensigns had lunch with the admiral on this ship. How could I refuse? He was a great person. He loved golf and I loved golf, and we had a lot of other things in common. After lunch, he told me he had enjoyed our time and wanted to welcome me, saying I'd do just fine on board. I thought that was an odd thing to say, considering the only duty he had ever seen me perform was to eat lunch. I knew my file was on the table next to him, but he had only flipped through it and put it down. I felt bold enough to ask him about the purpose of having lunch together. I mean, it was great that he wanted to get to know the new officers coming on board, but there had to be more to it. He pointed at me, smiled, and told me that the only reason he had lunch with new officers was to see if they put salt and pepper on their food before tasting it. I thought it was an odd statement until he explained. He said that if the new officer puts salt and pepper on before tasting the food, they are the type of person who makes decisions without gathering enough information and thinking things through beforehand. He nodded and told me he'd noticed that I had tasted my food before salting it, so that got a pass in his eyes. But he wasn't done with me. He told me there was one more thing. He also watched to see if I laid my fork down after each bite. He clarified that if I had kept it in my hand and just kept shoveling the food into my mouth, it might be a clue that I'm the kind of man who doesn't give myself time to think through my last action before moving on to the next one. At that moment, I remembered reading what the UCLA basketball coach John Wooden would tell his players on the court. He would say, "Be quick, but don't hurry." That's what this admiral was telling me. Don't hurry through your decisions. Hurry doesn't have to do with speed. It has to do with attitude. You might have to think quickly, but that doesn't mean you have to think hurriedly, carelessly, or sloppily. I thought that was brilliant. It was a great bit of advice, to be sure. However, just as interesting as the advice was the method by which he gained his information about me. He was a wise fellow, and he'd shared wisdom with me that I hadn't expected. That's the odd thing about wisdom. At times you may stumble across it, but more often you will likely find it when you seek it out. This became a life pattern for me, to search out mentors and to always be on the lookout for wisdom. By the way, I still eat like that, putting my fork down in between bites. And sometimes I might have to be quick, but I try to never be in a hurry. This was my first step in a high-level mentoring session, which I never forgot. Mentoring matters, right? Why does mentoring matter? I assume you have at least some curiosity about it because you picked up this book, which is full of stories about why mentoring matters. In fact, here is one. While I was at CCLA, a fellow named Tom Kemp took over as CEO. Tom was 80% a finance person. He had come up as a CFO to make sure the company maintained a steady financial balance, but he also had knowledge of sales and production. Tom was a great mentor regarding the financial aspects of the company. He maximized his commute time by refurbishing his van with a built-in desk and installing special shocks to absorb the rough roads between Laguna and Los Angeles. He hired a driver and used the drive time to read and write before arriving at work. Every morning, Tom entered the building through the back door and threw the Wall Street Journal on my desk. He had already highlighted anything he thought I needed to see. He thought it'd be a waste of my time to read the whole thing. I had always thought that Tom had an interesting way of mentoring others. He was saying, "I know you don't have time to read the whole thing because you're trying to run our operation, so I just read it for you. Later, I will mention how face-to-face mentoring is the preferred way, but the fact that Tom read the WSJ with a highlighter in his hand demonstrated to me that I, his mentee, was on his mind even as he traveled to work." Tom and I did have face-to-face time, of course. He'd call and say, "Let's go out to lunch today," or "Let's grab a sandwich." I knew that it wasn't because he needed someone to talk golf with, or because he had a lot of questions to ask me, or even to have a sandwich. He used that lunchtime to offer me insight into things I had not yet thought about, for example, how and why to prioritize certain tasks and how to make decisions. I'd been the COO of CCLA for a couple of years by this point, and a dozen regional operations reported to me. Although I was actually doing those things Tom shared with me, we both knew that I had room to grow and learn. The mentorship was a two-way relationship. It enriched us both and gave us companionship. In fact, Tom concluded every meeting by asking, "Now, what are you going to teach me?" I would talk to him about sales, routes, and customer relations. Some of our part-time drivers were firemen. Their fire schedules were 4 days on, 4 days off. During their off schedule, they would work a few days to make extra money. Tom always asked me how the firemen were doing. Even in his position, he was extremely curious and eager to learn from me, a fellow who reported to him. If both parties are open to it, and if it's done well, mentorship is a two-way street. You just might learn something from some unexpected people and in some unexpected places. In addition to Tom, 2 other mentors at CCLA blessed and helped me: Jack Atwood, the Senior Vice President of Marketing, and Art McDonald, the Chairman. Throughout this book, I will refer to servant leadership several times. Succinctly, servant leadership is about empowerment and participative management. They are the keys to effective team building in a servant leadership organization. To be an effective, well-rounded mentor, you must model servant leadership. The principles I present here in this book only make sense if you believe in this concept. Although this is not a book on servant leadership, the topic comes up often because it intertwines with mentorship. A traditional hierarchical system limits its participants. As a mentor, you must involve your people, support them, and guide them to resources that will propel them upward. Practice servant leadership by adhering to this verse, Mark 9:35, which says, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and servant of all." Meet the needs of the mentee. As a mentor, it doesn't help to be critical. The quickest way to destroy any vulnerability or trust from your mentee or any sharing they want to do is to criticize. That doesn't mean you never talk about points where the mentee needs to get stronger, smarter, or better. But you do it in an encouraging yet firm way, not harshly or negatively. Both partners need accountability, and I'll address this toward the end of the book. Accountability develops out of a committed relationship, which is why it is important to consider the matching process between a mentor and a mentee. The basic criteria include: do you have similar life situations, similar interests, and similar work? Yet, what a mentee wants from the partnership should not be overlooked. You have to be aware of multiple factors. Years later, when I taught at the Wharton School of Business, many of our younger MBA students desired a mentor from a different field, someone who could give them insight into an industry that they might eventually move into. I think this is a valid reason for a mentor, although not the main purpose. In addition, you must think long-term about the developmental needs of the mentee. Plus, consider their immediate life stressors when pairing. One of the MBA students, Nick, also a seminary graduate, it happens more often than you would think, made an appointment to see me after a few semesters of the program. He and his wife Sarah attended a local church where she was actively involved. Sarah assumed that after he completed his MBA, he would take a business advisory or CFO position at this church. Nick confessed he was uneasy about this, as he did not want to work in the church but to take Christ to the business world. He perceived the business community as his ministry. That was a real-life stressor, and it was affecting the decisions he was making about his future. This moment in our relationship sealed my role. If I was not willing to step into this situation with him as a mentor, then what value did I possess? Hence, I became a conflict mentor. Not long after, he called and asked if Sarah could attend one of our mentoring sessions, and I agreed. I understood this would be a conflict discussion. I expected her to be harsh and controlling, but I realized 3 minutes into our meeting that nothing was further from the truth. She was friendly, sharp, energetic, wonderful, and clearly supportive of Nick. Eventually, the topic came around to the disagreement. Sarah explained that the pastor and she had prayed about it and had come to the conclusion that Nick would be a great asset because the church needed some business advice. She was not wrong about these things, for Nick was a high-quality person with integrity, and many churches would benefit from his managerial and administrative gifts. Though Nick worked hard at his master's program, he wondered whether it was worth the effort if he wasn't going to use the education he received in the business field. During this meeting, we decided the 3 of us would continue to meet once a month and see how it evolved. Digging in. One day after our monthly meeting together, I took Nick and Sarah to a local Chick-fil-A in La Habra for lunch, and my friend Tom, who owns the franchise, came over and introduced himself. This was not something I had prearranged. We chatted briefly. It was quiet after he left until Sarah looked at me and asked, How can we get a Chick-fil-A franchise? I was shocked. A few days later, Nick called to tell me that Sarah was interested. He asked if I could help them obtain the information. So, we set up another meeting and they came back into my office. She didn't waste any time telling me that she thought the business would be right for both Nick and Sarah. This time my jaw did hit the floor. I didn't want to puncture their unexpected bubble of enthusiasm, but as someone who spent his whole life in business, I also didn't want them to have an incomplete picture. I told them that before they went any further, they needed to visit with Tom to get the gory details about the grueling schedule, evening hours and after hours, and the explicit details of what to expect as an owner. I didn't hear another word for a couple of months, and I decided not to call and ask them about it. I thought maybe the idea had died. Finally, I heard back. Sarah had been doing research and learned that it's almost impossible to get a Chick-fil-A franchise if you haven't worked in one. Tom hired her into his store to be on the floor at an entry-level position. She's smart, and she quickly made a positive impression and worked her way up. When Tom was awarded another franchise in the next town over, he put her in charge of that new store. By now, Nick had finished his MBA, and Tom hired him to be the finance controller and handle all the administrative paperwork and assorted details of the business. Shortly thereafter, Tom and I were talking, and he commented that he didn't know how this couple managed it, but he was thoroughly impressed with their work ethic and results. I reminded him that they were still interested in ownership, and he went on to say that a few locations on the expansion plan were available. We joined forces to encourage them to apply, even though we knew they were still 6 months short of having been in business long enough to own a franchise. They applied just before the COVID pandemic, and lo and behold, they got one out in Riverside, California. What a hard time it was to open a restaurant, but they dug down deep and worked hard. The last time I talked to Tom, he said that their daily sales were great. Even though they're both busy, they've become terrific mentors to their employees on the floor, the cooks, and everyone on their team. That's encouraging to me as a mentor. Not only did they benefit from mentoring, but they valued it highly enough to pass it on. I hope their mentees will keep the mentoring chain going. Passing the baton. Mentoring can never be one type fits all. A set format usually doesn't fall into place until the people involved understand who they are and what they need. Working through those tough and real questions means being willing to put down your own agenda and be an encouraging presence. That will lead to a solid relationship and foundation for mentoring. The mentor needs to encourage the mentee to attempt activities outside of their comfort zone and make sure they face their fears, failures, and successes. The mentor needs to be cognizant of whether the mentee is mentoring others underneath them in their organization. As you meet together, a strategy will become focused. The baton will be passed from the mentor to the mentee, and then the mentee will pass it to their mentees. The beauty of a mentoring relationship is that it is never completed. The mentee will always be able to come back to the